When dread rises at the thought of someone else forming a verdict about you, it rarely announces itself honestly. It disguises itself as concern for the relationship, as practical worry about consequences, a simple anticipation of an answer, but sit with that dread a little longer than is comfortable, and a different shape begins to emerge beneath it. What you are actually afraid of is not really them. It is the possibility that the parts of yourself you have never looked at directly will be exposed, named, and found wanting by someone standing outside you. This happens because most of us carry quietly and unconsciously entire regions of ourselves we have not yet claimed, doubts about our worth, old wounds from earlier judgments, images of inadequacy formed long before we had the capacity to question them. These do not disappear simply because we refuse to look at them. They go underground, and once they are underground, they do not stop functioning. They simply stop being visible to us. We lose track of the fact that the fear belongs to us, and it begins to feel instead like something that belongs to the outside world, something that other people hold and might, at any moment, use against us. This is why waiting for someone else's decision can feel so unbearable. It is not one fear, but two, compressed into a single moment. There is the ordinary fear of an unwanted outcome, of rejection, of loss, of disappointment, but layered beneath it is something older and less rational, the fear that a truth about yourself, one you have never had the courage to examine on your own terms, is about to be spoken aloud by someone else, and you will have no choice but to hear it. Notice the peculiar arithmetic at work here. The other person has not yet said anything. They have not rendered any verdict. And yet the dread is already fully formed, already vivid, already convincing. This tells you something important. The fear did not originate with them. It was already present, waiting for an occasion, and their pending decision simply gave it a stage on which to perform. Take away this particular person, this particular decision, and the same dread would likely resurface elsewhere, attached to some other looming judgment, because its source was never really external to begin with. This is uncomfortable to recognize, because it is far easier to imagine the problem as something happening to you rather than something unfolding within you. It is easier to fear a verdict than to face the unclaimed material that gives that verdict its power. But there is also something quietly hopeful in this recognition. If the dread originates inside you, then it can also be met there, examined there, and slowly, patiently worked with there, rather than left hostage to whatever any other person happens to decide. Projection is one of the quietest and most persistent habits of the mind. It does not announce itself as projection. It simply feels like perception. When you imagine someone judging you harshly, dismissing your effort, or finding you lacking, it rarely occurs to you in the moment that you might be looking at your own reflection rather than at them. The image feels external, vivid, almost self-evidently true. And yet, more often than not, what you are encountering is a judgment you already carry, temporarily relocated onto someone else's face because it is easier to bear that way. There is a reason the mind works like this. Holding an uncomfortable truth about yourself in full awareness. I doubt my own worth. I am afraid I am not good enough. I suspect I have failed here. Requires a kind of direct confrontation that many of us instinctively avoid. It is far less painful to experience that same content as coming from outside. They think I am not good enough, rather than I fear I am not good enough. The feeling is nearly identical in intensity, but its apparent source has shifted, and with that shift comes a strange temporary relief. The problem now seems to belong to someone else's opinion rather than to your own unexamined self-image. This is why the people we fear judging us most harshly often turn out, on closer inspection, to be judging us with precisely the severity we already apply to ourselves. The imagined disapproval of a parent, a partner, an employer carries the exact tone and content of our own inner critic. We rarely project generosity we do not already possess, or cruelty we have never felt toward ourselves. The material has to come from somewhere, and that somewhere is always closer to home than we would like to admit. The difficulty is that projection is, by its nature, invisible from the inside. You cannot simply decide one day to stop doing it, because you do not experience it as projection while it is happening. You experience it as clear-eyed observation of the world. The only way through is patient, repeated noticing, catching yourself in the act of assuming the worst about another's judgment, and pausing long enough to ask where that particular judgment first took root. Often it did not begin with this person at all. It began years earlier in some other room with some other voice, and has simply been carried forward and reattached to whoever now occupies a position of consequence in your life. This does not mean other people never judge you or that their opinions are always fictions of your own making. Sometimes disapproval is real and warranted, but the intensity of your fear, the almost physical dread that precedes any actual verdict, is rarely proportional to what the other person has actually said or done. That gap between the size of the fear and the size of the situation is usually where projection lies, waiting to be recognized rather than simply endured. There is a distinction worth making carefully because the two things are so often confused that most people never separate them at all. One is influence, the plain fact that other people's choices shape the circumstances of your life. A decision made by someone else can change where you live, whether a relationship continues, what opportunities remain open to you, how your days are structured. This is simply the nature of being connected to other human beings, and no amount of psychological insight will make it otherwise. To pretend that others' choices don't matter would be a kind of denial, not wisdom. The second thing is worth, and this is where the confusion begins. Somewhere along the way, many of us learned to treat these two categories as though they were the same, as though a person's decision about our circumstances were also automatically a decision about our value. Someone chooses to end a relationship, and it is received not simply as a change in circumstance, but as a verdict on lovability. Someone withholds approval at work, and it is felt not as a comment on a particular piece of work, but as a judgment on competence itself, or worse, on worth as a person. The external decision and the internal meaning become fused, as though one necessarily produces the other. But look closely, and the fusion does not hold. Worth is not something that can actually be handed to you by another person, which means it is also not something that can actually be taken away by one. What happens instead is quieter and stranger. We hand over the authority to determine our worth, piece by piece, usually without noticing we are doing it, until it feels as though the other person always held that power natively. It begins to feel less like a loan and more like a fact of nature. This is the illusion worth examining. The power was never native to them, and it was granted, and because it was granted, it can also be reconsidered. This does not mean indifference is the answer, or that you should try to convince yourself other people's decisions don't hurt. They can hurt a great deal, and pretending otherwise is its own kind of self-deception. What changes once the distinction is seen clearly is not the presence of pain, but its meaning. A door closing because of someone else's choice can be grieved as a real loss, a real change in circumstance, without also being absorbed as evidence about your fundamental worth. The two can be separated even though they have spent a lifetime traveling together in your mind. This separation takes practice because the habit of fusing the two runs deep, often formed early, often reinforced by years of treating other people's reactions as the final word on who you are. But the moment you can hold a painful decision in one hand and your own sense of worth in the other, without one collapsing into the other, something genuinely shifts. The circumstance remains real. The verdict on your worth, however, was never actually theirs to render. A house built without its own foundation will still stand for a while. As long as nothing pushes against it too hard, it borrows its stability from whatever happens to be around it. A neighboring wall, a stretch of calm weather, the simple absence of disturbance. This is what it looks like to build an identity on the opinions of others rather than on something more deeply your own. It can hold up reasonably well during ordinary conditions. The trouble comes when conditions change, as they inevitably do, and there is nothing internal to keep the structure standing on its own. This is the quiet cost of outsourcing identity. Each time your sense of worth depends on the most recent verdict, praise from a colleague, approval from a parent, warmth from a partner, you are, in effect, handing over the blueprint of who you are to whoever happens to be present. And because different people carry different expectations, different moods, different capacities for generosity or criticism, the result is a self that is constantly being redrawn. You are competent today because someone said so, and doubtful tomorrow because someone else's silence felt like disapproval. Nothing about you has actually changed between these 2 days, and yet the experience yourself has shifted entirely because the foundation was never yours to begin with. Over time, this produces a particular kind of exhaustion, one that is hard to name because it doesn't come from any single event. It comes from the accumulated effort of constant rebuilding, reading each new room for cues about how to feel about yourself in it, adjusting your internal posture based on signals you did not choose and cannot control. Some people live their entire lives this way without recognizing the pattern, mistaking the exhaustion for a personality trait or for simple sensitivity, rather than seeing it as the natural consequence of having no ground beneath their own sense of self. The alternative is not the absence of care for what others think. That would be its own kind of poverty, a hardened indifference mistaken for strength. The alternative is having enough of your own foundation that other people's opinions can be received as information, sometimes useful and sometimes not, rather than as the material the entire structure depends on. This distinction matters enormously in practice. A person with their own foundation can hear criticism and consider it seriously without the criticism threatening to bring the whole house down. A person without one experiences even small disapprovals as structural emergencies, because in a very real sense they are. Building this kind of foundation is slow, unglamorous work, and it rarely happens through insight alone. It comes from returning again and again to your own experience, your own values, your own sense of what you know to be true about yourself, independent of whoever is in the room that day. It means noticing when you have started rearranging your self concept to match someone else's mood, and gently asking whether that rearrangement reflects anything real, or whether it is simply another visitor being allowed, once again, to hold the blueprint that was always meant to be yours. Most of us have spent far more time studying other people than studying ourselves. We have learned, often without realizing it, to read a room within seconds, to notice a slight change in tone, a hesitation before a response, a shift in posture that might signal disapproval. This skill develops early and runs deep, because for many people, safety once depended on it. If you could anticipate what others wanted, needed, or expected, you could adjust in time to avoid conflict, rejection, or disappointment. What gets lost in the process almost without our noticing is the far quieter and less rehearsed skill of noticing what we ourselves believe, want, or feel when there is no audience present at all. This is why the question of what you think of yourself, asked plainly and without an audience to perform for, can feel strangely disorienting. Many people find they cannot answer it quickly, or that the answer that surfaces first is actually someone else's voice wearing the disguise of their own. A parent's old assessment, a teacher's offhand comment, a partner's criticism repeated so many times internally that it now arrives sounding like personal conviction rather than borrowed opinion. Separating your own voice from these inherited ones is not simple, and it is not something that happens through a single moment of reflection. It requires patient, repeated attention. The reason this inward turn matters so much is that it is the only question capable of interrupting the endless cycle of seeking verdicts from outside. As long as your primary source of self knowledge is other people's reactions, you will always be, in some sense, waiting for the next comment, the next silence, the next decision that might tell you something about who you are. This waiting can occupy an enormous portion of a life without ever being named as such. But the moment you begin asking seriously and repeatedly what you believe about yourself, independent of any observer, the waiting begins to loosen its grip, because you are no longer entirely dependent on external information to know where you stand. This is not a question with a single, tidy answer arrived at once and then filed away. It is closer to a discipline, something returned to again and again, in quiet moments, in moments of doubt, in moments when someone else's opinion threatens to overwhelm your own. Each time you ask it honestly, you strengthen a muscle that has likely gone underused for years. The capacity to locate your own perspective before consulting anyone else's. This does not mean disregarding other viewpoints or refusing feedback. It means having something of your own already in place before that feedback arrives, so that it is received by a person with a standing perspective, rather than an empty room waiting to be furnished by whoever walks in. Most people never ask this question seriously, not because it is difficult to understand, but because it is uncomfortable to sit with the initial silence that follows it, the unfamiliar quiet of hearing nothing back at first, before your own voice, long buried under other people's, begins to find its way to the surface. Most of us have spent far more time studying other people than studying ourselves. We have learned, often without realizing it, to read a room within seconds, to notice a slight change in tone, a hesitation before a response, a shift in posture that might signal disapproval. This skill develops early and runs deep, because for many people, safety once depended on it. If you could anticipate what others wanted, needed, or expected, you could adjust in time to avoid conflict, rejection, or disappointment. What gets lost in the process, almost without our noticing, is the far quieter and less rehearsed skill of noticing what we ourselves believe, want, or feel when there is no audience present at all. This is why the question of what you think of yourself, asked plainly and without an audience to perform for, can feel strangely disorienting. Many people find they cannot answer it quickly, or that the answer that surfaces first is actually someone else's voice wearing the disguise of their own. A parent's old assessment, a teacher's offhand comment, a partner's criticism, repeated so many times internally that it now arrives sounding like personal conviction rather than borrowed opinion. Separating your own voice from these inherited ones is not simple, and it is not something that happens through a single moment of reflection. It requires patient, repeated attention. The reason this inward turn matters so much is that it is the only question capable of interrupting the endless cycle of seeking verdicts from outside. As long as your primary source of self-knowledge is other people's reactions, you will always be, in some sense, waiting for the next comment, the next silence, the next decision that might tell you something about who you are. This waiting can occupy an enormous portion of a life without ever being named as such. But the moment you begin asking seriously and repeatedly what you believe about yourself independent of any observer, the waiting begins to loosen its grip, because you are no longer entirely dependent on external information to know where you stand. This is not a question with a single tidy answer arrived at once and then filed away. It is closer to a discipline, something returned to again and again, in quiet moments, in moments of doubt, in moments when someone else's opinion threatens to overwhelm your own. Each time you ask it honestly, you strengthen a muscle that has likely gone underused for years, the capacity to locate your own perspective before consulting anyone else's. This does not mean disregarding other viewpoints or refusing feedback. It means having something of your own already in place before that feedback arrives, so that it is received by a person with a standing perspective rather than an empty room waiting to be furnished by whoever walks in. Most people never ask this question seriously, not because it is difficult to understand, but because it is uncomfortable to sit the initial silence that follows it. The unfamiliar quiet of hearing nothing back at first. Before your own voice, long buried under other people's, begins to find its way to the surface, there is a particular kind of quiet that settles in once the earlier work has genuinely taken root. Not a dramatic before and after, but a gradual loosening, noticeable mostly in retrospect. You find yourself receiving news that once would have unsettled you for days, and something in you simply does not collapse the way it used to. The decision still registers. It may still carry real weight and real consequence, but it no longer arrives as a verdict handed down about your fundamental worth. It arrives instead as one event among many, something to be absorbed and responded to, rather than something capable of rewriting who you understand yourself to be. This change does not happen because the people around you have grown kinder or more careful with their opinions. It happens because something has shifted on your end of the exchange. The dread that once accompanied every anticipated judgment has been traced back patiently to its actual origin, and met there rather than left to operate in the dark. The habit of projecting your own unexamined fears onto other people's faces has been caught often enough that it no longer moves as quickly or as invisibly as it once did. The old confusion between someone shaping your circumstances and someone determining your worth has been slowly pulled apart, so that a loss can be felt fully as a loss without also being received as a condemnation of your character. The foundation that once depended on whoever happened to be standing nearby has been gradually replaced with something sturdier, built through your own repeated attention rather than borrowed each time from the room you happen to be in. And the parts of yourself once kept in shadow, once so easily triggered by even a hint of external disapproval, have been faced directly enough that there is simply less left for anyone else to accidentally expose. None of this makes the external decision disappear or stop mattering in practical terms. People will still choose to stay or leave, to include or exclude, to approve or withhold approval, and these choices will continue to shape the real conditions of a life. What has changed is not the existence of the decision, but its reach. It can no longer travel all the way down into your sense of worth uninvited. The premise embedded in the title, that someone is about to decide something significant about you, turns out to have been only partially true from the start. They can decide something about your circumstances. They were never in a position to decide something about your fundamental value, no matter how total that power once felt. The decision that actually mattered, the one determining whether any outside verdict could shake the whole structure or simply move through it, was never theirs to make. It belonged from the beginning to you, in how honestly you are willing to examine your fears, recognize your projections, separate influence from worth, and build something of your own to stand on. This is not a decision finalized once and then set aside. It is renewed quietly over and over. Each time a judgment looms, and you choose to ask what you already know about yourself rather than wait anxiously for someone else to tell you.